The machines were still beeping when I walked in. My mother was conscious. Barely. Her hand was on the blanket. Fingers open. Like she was waiting for someone to take it. No one had. The chair beside her bed was warm when I sat down. Someone had just been sitting there. I looked around the room. The hallway. The window. Nothing. Just the sound of the monitor and the smell of antiseptic and the strange, heavy silence that hospitals carry at 2 in the afternoon when visiting hours are almost over. My mother looked at me. She didn't speak. But her eyes moved to the door. Then back to me. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was the one who lived farthest away. That's how it always worked in our family. My older brother and younger sister both lived in the same city as our mother, within 20 minutes of her house. They handled the appointments, the groceries, the pharmacy runs, the phone calls with the doctors. I was 3 hours away by train, and for the past several years, I had been the one who sent money, called every Sunday, and visited when I could. Which, I'll admit, wasn't often enough. My mother was 71. She had 2 health conditions, a heart problem she'd had since her 50s, and a kidney issue that had gotten worse in the last 2 years. Nothing that should have been a death sentence. Manageable, the doctors had always said. With the right care and follow-up, entirely manageable. I had always assumed the right care was happening. I assumed wrong. The first sign was a phone call I almost didn't think about. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn. My mother called me at her usual time, 9 o'clock, right after the news. But that night, she sounded different. Not upset. Not scared. Just careful. Like she was choosing her words slowly. She asked me if I was doing well. She asked about my work. Then she asked, very quietly, if I had spoken to my brother recently. I said no. Not in a few weeks. She said, okay. Just that. Okay. Then she changed the subject. I remember thinking it was nothing. She did that sometimes, started a thought and dropped it. I put it down to tiredness, to age, to the fact that she had probably had a long day. But when I hung up, there was something sitting in the back of my throat. A small, quiet discomfort I couldn't name. I called my brother that same night. He answered immediately. He was cheerful. He told me everything was fine. He said our mother had a routine checkup that week and the doctor was happy with her levels. He said she had been eating well, sleeping well. He said she seemed good. He said all the right things. Too many right things, actually. Smoothly. Without pause. Like a list he had prepared. I didn't say that, of course. I said okay. I said thank you for looking after her. I said I would try to visit soon. When I hung up the second time, the discomfort was still there. 2 weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. It was a nurse. She worked the afternoon shift at the hospital. She told me she was calling from her personal phone, not the ward, and that she hoped I wouldn't mind. She said my mother had been brought in the night before. Cardiac episode. She had been stabilized. She was resting now. The nurse paused. Then she said something I didn't understand at first. She said, your brother and sister were here. They filled in a form. I said, what form? Another pause. Longer this time. She said, a resuscitation directive. A do not resuscitate order. She spoke slowly, like she was being careful. It was signed by 2 next of kin. I sat down. I didn't remember sitting. I was just suddenly sitting. I said, my mother signed it. The nurse's voice dropped lower. She said, that's why I called. I visited the following weekend. I didn't tell my brother or sister I was coming. I arrived on a Saturday morning. My mother was still in the hospital, recovering. She seemed smaller than the last time I had seen her. But her eyes were clear when she saw me. I sat beside her. I held her hand. And very gently, very carefully, I asked her if she had signed any paperwork recently. Any documents about her medical care. She looked at me for a long time. Then she shook her head. Not sadly. Not dramatically. Just a slow, certain, quiet movement. No. I looked at the window. I looked at her hand in mine. I kept my voice level. I asked if she knew what a DNR was. She said, the no revival thing. I said, yes. She said, they told me it was just a standard form. That everyone signs it. I nodded. I didn't say anything else. I poured her some water. I fixed her blanket. I stayed for 3 hours and talked about ordinary things, and when I left, I kissed her forehead. In the elevator, I stood very still. I thought about my brother's voice on the phone. The smooth answers. The prepared list. I thought about my sister, who had not called me once in the 2 months since my mother's health had gotten worse. Not once. I thought about what the nurse had risked to call me. Something was moving beneath all of this. Something slow and deliberate. And it had been moving for a while. I had been reacting until now. Calling back, checking in, taking people at their word, assuming the best. That wasn't working. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. I did not go home that Sunday. I told my office I needed a few extra days. Personal matter. They understood. I found a small guest house 10 minutes from the hospital. Nothing special, a clean room, a window that faced a parking lot, a kettle on a small table. I didn't need much. I needed proximity. I needed to be close without being visible. I started with what I could access legally and quietly. My mother had, years ago, added my name to her bank account. She had done it after my father died, when she realized she needed someone trustworthy on record. My brother didn't know this. My sister didn't either. My mother had told me and then we had never discussed it again. It took me 20 minutes at an ATM and online portal to pull up the last 18 months of transaction history. I sat in the guesthouse room with a notepad and I went through every line. It took 2 hours. By the end, my notepad had 4 pages of notes and my tea had gone completely cold. The withdrawals started 14 months ago. Not large ones at first. Amounts that could be explained. Groceries, utilities, a pharmacy charge here and there. Normal things. But layered between the normal things were transfers. Regular. Timed. Always on the same day of the month, always a round number, always to the same external account. The amount had increased 3 times over 14 months. What my mother was receiving in her pension, and what remained in her account after these transfers, did not match what a woman managing 2 chronic health conditions should have been living on. I calculated the pharmacy charges against her prescriptions. I had the prescription list, I had helped organize her medications the year before, and I still had the document saved on my phone. The numbers didn't line up. Either she was not filling all her prescriptions, or someone was filling them and keeping the change. Both options made my chest feel tight in a way I didn't allow myself to sit with for long. I moved on. The second piece came from the hospital itself. I did not confront anyone. I did not demand records. I simply asked to speak with the patient liaison officer, a quiet, methodical woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke in measured sentences. I told her I was a family member who lived out of the city and that I was concerned about some paperwork related to my mother's care. I asked, calmly, whether I could understand the process by which a do not resuscitate directive was filed and what documentation was required. She explained it carefully. She told me that a DNR required either the patient's own signature, witnessed, or, in cases where the patient lacked capacity to decide, the signature of a legal next of kin with documented proof of that incapacity. I asked what proof had been submitted in my mother's case. She looked at her screen for a moment. Then she looked at me over her glasses. She said, "I'll need to check the file more carefully. Can you come back this afternoon?" I came back at 3. She slid a printed summary across the desk. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me and waited. The form listed my mother as lacking capacity at the time of signing. It cited a document, a short written statement from a private clinic, that described her as showing signs of cognitive decline significant enough to impair medical decision-making. My mother, who had spoken to me clearly and coherently 3 days ago. Who had told me, with steady eyes and certain words, that she had not understood what she was signing. The private clinic listed on the document was a 15-minute drive from my brother's home. I wrote down the clinic name. I wrote down the date of the assessment. I thanked the liaison officer. I left. In the car park, I sat in my car and did not move for several minutes. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't disbelief, even. It was something colder than that. Something that felt almost like recognition. Like a shape emerging slowly from fog, not shocking, because part of me had already suspected it. Just finally, undeniably visible. My brother had power of attorney over my mother's property. She had signed it 2 years ago, when her health had first started declining. She had trusted him. He lived close. It had seemed practical. My sister was a co-signatory on the DNR form. Between the two of them, they had been moving money out of my mother's account for over a year. They had obtained a document from a private clinic, a document I was now almost certain my mother had not fully understood, that declared her cognitively incapable. They had used that document to sign a DNR on her behalf. My mother was not dying. She was inconvenient. And they were managing the inconvenience. I drove back to the guest house. I photographed every page of my notepad. I screenshotted every bank transaction. I wrote a clear, dated summary of everything I had seen, what I had found, how I had found it, who I had spoken to, what had been said. I sent copies to 2 email addresses that existed only for this purpose, created that week on a device I had bought secondhand with cash. Then I sat at the small table and looked at the parking lot for a long time. Part of me wanted to drive to my brother's house immediately, to walk up to his front door, to ask him, face to face, to explain every single transaction and every single signature. But I thought about my mother's hand on the blanket. Fingers open. Waiting. I thought about how far this had already gone. How carefully it had been arranged. How many layers it had. If I walked into that house angry and empty-handed, they would close ranks. Delete files. Prepare explanations. Maybe even accelerate whatever they were planning next. Confronting them would have ruined everything. The next morning, I woke up before 5. Not because of an alarm. I just opened my eyes and the room was dark and my mind was already moving. Already organizing. Already building the sequence of what needed to happen next. I made tea. I sat at the small table. I opened my notepad. And I made a list. Not of grievances. Not of emotions. A list of steps. Ordered, numbered, specific. The kind of list you make when you cannot afford to miss anything. There is something clarifying about that kind of focus. When the feeling is too large to carry, the list becomes the container. You stop feeling and you start moving. One line at a time. The first call I made was to a solicitor. Not a family friend. Not someone recommended by anyone who knew my brother. I found her through a legal directory, an elder law specialist with 20 years of experience and an office in a building that smelled like old carpet and quiet competence. Her name was on a small brass plate beside the door. She had no social media presence. She returned calls within the hour. I told her everything. I spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. She took notes. I could hear the pen moving steadily on the other end. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a calm, unhurried voice, "You've done the right things in the right order. That matters more than most people realize." She told me what we needed. A formal capacity assessment from an independent geriatric specialist, not the private clinic my brother had used, but a court-recognized practitioner. Certified copies of the bank records. A written statement from the nurse who had first called me, if she was willing. A formal request to the hospital to place a flag on my mother's file, preventing any further directives from being added without independent review. She said she would file an emergency application with the Court of Protection to have the existing DNR suspended pending investigation. She said it quietly. Like it was a practical matter. Like she had done it before. Because she had. The nurse was willing. I met her outside the hospital on her break. She was younger than I expected, early 30s, dark circles under her eyes, hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. She told me she had been thinking about calling me for weeks before she finally did it. She said she had almost talked herself out of it 3 times. I told her I was glad she hadn't. She told me what she had seen. My brother and sister arriving together on a Tuesday evening. The conversation with the ward administrator that she had partly overheard through a door that hadn't been fully closed. The form being signed quickly. The administrator, who was not a doctor, she made this point carefully, accepting the documentation from the private clinic without apparent scrutiny. She told me my mother had been awake that evening. She had seen her through the window of her room while all of this was happening in the hallway. Sitting up. Reading a magazine. Awake. Aware. Not consulted. The nurse agreed to provide a written statement. She asked if she needed a lawyer of her own. I told her I would ask mine. She nodded and finished her coffee and went back inside. She didn't look frightened. She looked relieved. Some people wait a long time for someone to finally ask them to say what they already know. The independent capacity assessment was arranged within 4 days. My solicitor moved quickly and quietly through channels my brother would have no reason to monitor. The geriatric specialist visited my mother on a Thursday morning. My brother and sister were not informed. They had no legal obligation to be present for an independent assessment of this kind, and we saw no reason to change that. The specialist spent 90 minutes with my mother. She asked her questions. She showed her documents. She tested memory and reasoning and comprehension and judgment. She did it gently, the way professionals do when they have been doing something long enough to understand that gentleness is not weakness, it is accuracy. Her report came back the following Monday. My mother demonstrated full cognitive capacity. Her responses were consistent, lucid, and contextually appropriate. She expressed clear preferences regarding her medical care. She stated, on record, that she had not understood the nature of the document she had been asked to sign and that she would not have signed it had the purpose been explained to her. One sentence in the report stayed with me. The specialist wrote, "There is no clinical basis for the assertion of cognitive impairment documented in the prior assessment. The discrepancy between that document and the patient's current presentation is significant and warrants scrutiny." Scrutiny. A quiet, professional, devastating word. By the end of the second week, the picture was complete. My solicitor had filed the emergency application. The Court of Protection had issued an interim order suspending the DNR and freezing my brother's power of attorney pending a full hearing. The hospital had placed a formal flag on my mother's file. No further directives, no medical decisions, no transfers of authority, nothing, without independent legal review. The bank, presented with certified evidence of the transaction pattern, had flagged the account for a financial abuse investigation. The amounts transferred over 14 months came to just under £40,000. The private clinic had been referred to the relevant medical regulatory body. The practitioner who had signed the capacity assessment had been asked to provide their notes and methodology. They had not yet responded. That silence, my solicitor told me, was itself informative. Through all of this, my brother and sister continued their routines. My brother called my mother twice that week. She told me afterwards. He was cheerful. He talked about the weather, about his work, about a television program he had been watching. He did not mention the hospital. He did not mention her health. He didn't know I was in the city. He didn't know what had been filed. He didn't know that a letter was being prepared for him, carrying the formal seal of a legal institution, that would arrive on his doormat on a Friday morning. He went about his week as if everything was normal. As if nothing was shifting beneath his feet. My sister sent my mother a photograph of her children that Thursday. Captioned it with a small heart. My mother showed it to me when I visited. She didn't say anything about it. She just looked at it for a moment and then set her phone face down on the blanket. Some silences say everything. I drove back to the guest house that evening and checked every document one final time. Every copy. Every backup. Every email chain. Every signed statement. Everything was in order. Everything was protected. Everything was ready. My solicitor confirmed the letters would be delivered Friday morning. I set an alarm and for the first time in 2 weeks, I slept through the night. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. Friday arrived the way important days sometimes do. Quietly. No signal. No weight in the air. Just pale morning light coming through the guesthouse curtains and the distant sound of a lorry on the main road and the alarm on my phone reading 6:47 a.m. I got up. I showered. I made tea. I sat at the small table one last time and looked at the parking lot, which was nearly empty at that hour, and I thought about my mother's hand on that hospital blanket the first day I had walked in. Fingers open. Waiting. I thought about how long she had been waiting before I arrived. Then I picked up my phone and told my solicitor I was ready. The letters were delivered at 9:15 a.m. I know the exact time because my solicitor's office had arranged tracked delivery and she sent me the confirmation the moment it registered. I was sitting in a coffee shop 2 streets from the hospital at that moment. I had a book open on the table that I wasn't reading. I looked at the confirmation on my phone. I put the phone face down. I picked up my cup. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. There was no rush of satisfaction. No sense of victory. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of settling. Like a long-held breath finally released. My brother called me at 9:52 a.m. I let it ring. He called again at 10:04. Then 10:11. Then a text message, 3 words, all capitals. I read it once and set the phone aside. My sister called at 10:30. I let that ring too. My solicitor had been clear. No direct communication. Not yet. Not until the formal process had its own momentum. Anything I said could be used to cloud the picture, to introduce emotion where there was currently only evidence. The evidence was clean. I intended to keep it that way. At 11 a.m., I walked to the hospital. My mother knew something was happening. I had told her, carefully and simply, 2 days before. I had sat beside her bed with the window light coming in and I had explained what I had found. Not everything at once. I had chosen my words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, slowly, deliberately, watching her face. She had listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She looked at me. She said, I kept thinking I was being foolish. For feeling something was wrong. I said, you weren't foolish. She said, I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't say anything to that. I just held her hand. That was 2 days ago. Now, when I walked into her room on Friday morning, she looked at me and she knew from my face that it had begun. She didn't ask any questions. She just moved her legs slightly to make room on the edge of the bed and I sat down and we stayed like that for a while. Just quiet. Just together. The window was open slightly. Traffic sounds from below. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart with a squeaky wheel moved slowly past. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Except nothing was ordinary anymore. The formal hearing took place 3 weeks later. I will not describe it in legal detail because the details are less important than what they produced. What I will say is that the room was calm. Wood-paneled, institutional, designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. My solicitor sat beside me. My mother's independent advocate sat across. Representatives from the bank's fraud investigation unit had submitted documentation. The regulatory body investigating the private clinic had submitted preliminary findings. My brother and sister sat on the other side of the room with their own legal representation. I looked at them once when I came in. Just once. My brother was wearing a tie I recognized, grey, slightly too wide, the kind he always wore to occasions he considered important. He was looking at the table. My sister had her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than I remembered. I looked away and I did not look at them again. The evidence was presented. The bank records. The capacity assessment. The independent specialist's report. The nurse's written statement. The hospital flag documentation. The discrepancy between the private clinic's assessment and the independent one. All of it, laid out in sequence, factual and unambiguous. My brother's legal representative attempted 3 separate lines of argument. The first was that the transfers were consensual, that my mother had agreed to contribute financially to household expenses she benefited from. The independent advocate asked my mother, on record, whether this was true. My mother said no. Simply. Clearly. Without hesitation. The second argument was that the capacity assessment had been obtained in good faith based on genuine concern for my mother's well-being. The regulatory body's preliminary findings, presented in a written summary, indicated that the clinic practitioner had conducted an assessment of significantly shorter duration than standard protocol required, had not administered recognized cognitive testing instruments, and had a prior professional relationship with my brother that had not been disclosed. The third argument was never fully completed. The representative stopped partway through, conferred briefly with my brother in a whispered exchange, and then sat back and said nothing further. The outcomes were not dramatic. They rarely are, when everything has been done properly. The power of attorney was permanently revoked. A court-appointed independent deputy was assigned to oversee my mother's financial and medical affairs going forward, with regular reporting requirements and no family member permitted to act unilaterally. The £40,000 was ordered to be repaid in full, with a civil enforcement mechanism attached should my brother fail to comply within the designated period. The bank's fraud investigation had been referred to the Police Financial Crimes Unit. Whether criminal charges would follow was now a matter for that process, not for me. The private clinic practitioner had been suspended pending a full disciplinary investigation. The DNR was formally voided. My mother's medical file was updated. Her treating physicians were notified. Nothing like that could be filed again without her direct, witnessed, informed consent. My sister, who had co-signed the DNR, received a formal caution and was placed under a civil injunction restricting her involvement in my mother's care and finances. Whether she understood what she had participated in, or whether she had simply followed her brother's lead without fully grasping the weight of it, that was something I could not determine. But it was no longer something I needed to determine. The court had made its own assessment. I stayed for 2 more weeks after the hearing. I used the time practically. I helped transfer my mother's care to a new GP practice. I reorganized her prescriptions. I set up a direct delivery arrangement so her medications came to her door. I contacted a reputable home care agency and arranged for a support worker to visit 3 times a week, someone vetted, someone independent, someone with no connection to anyone in our family. I called the nurse who had first reached out to me. I told her the outcome. She was quiet for a moment on the other end, and then she said she was glad. That was all. Just that she was glad. I thought about all the times she must have seen situations like this and said nothing, because saying something felt too risky, too complicated, too unlikely to change anything. I told her she had changed something. She said, "So did you?" On my last evening, I visited my mother. She was sitting up in bed, better than she had been in months. Some color had returned to her face. She had eaten a proper dinner. She had a book on the bedside table she was actually reading. We talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with any of this. She told me about a dream she'd had. She asked about my work. She told me a story about my father I had never heard before, something small and funny that had happened 30 years ago. She laughed telling it, a real laugh, quiet and genuine. I watched her and I thought about all the ways a person can be slowly diminished without anyone on the outside noticing. Not through violence. Not through anything loud. Just through quiet removal. Quiet decisions made on their behalf. Quiet forms signed in hallways while they sit in the next room, awake and unaware. Quiet is not always safe. I had learned that. But quiet, handled correctly, was also how you undo it. I kissed her forehead when I left. She held my hand for a moment at the door. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. There was something in the way she looked at me that said everything she needed to say. I walked to my car. I drove to the guest house. I packed my bag. I sat at the small table one last time and looked at the parking lot, now full and ordinary in the evening light. I closed my notepad. I put it in my bag. I turned off the lamp. That night, everything was quiet. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever had to fight quietly for someone who couldn't fight for themselves, You'll know exactly what this silence feels like. You did the right thing. Even when no one was watching.